Now let's talk about how to work with textures in ZBrush. So when I talk about textures, I just mean texture maps, 2D images that we can use. And so there's three different spots that I want to show you here. The first one is the texture palette. So if we open this up, this is where you can import textures. So if you have image files that you want to bring in, you can go to import and bring those in. You can also go to your lightbox and grab textures that have come with ZBrush. You can see there's some textures here. I don't have all of them listed here, but anything that you import will show up. You also have buttons related to Spotlight and doing some texture painting, which we'll look at later. Some buttons on kind of flipping and rotating those. You can also create new textures. So we can change the width and height and create a new texture map. And we can grab the document to create a texture. Remember though, when we paint on our model, we're poly painting. We're not painting a texture map. And so working with textures in ZBrush is a little bit different. You don't need to have a texture when you go in and paint, but if you're going to export this out as a map, then that's when you'll want to create a texture. And you can also apply textures to your models. So over here on the left-hand side, right under stroke, alpha, and right above the material is texture. And so we can open this texture bin and we can see lots of different texture images. If we click on one of these, let's click on the star. We have it loaded up, but you can see nothing is applied. So this is not where we would go to apply a texture to a model as a whole. This is where we would go to say, okay, when I'm creating this brush, I want to use a texture as the end of the brush. So if I kind of paint across here, you can see there are instances of that texture. And so it's actually using that as kind of the end of the brush, right? If we use the drag rectangle, it becomes more apparent. I can actually drag out instances of that texture. So this is where we can go to add textures as part of our brush work, okay, as to help us when we're painting on when we're poly painting on our model. Now to actually apply a texture in the traditional sense to our model, we would go into the tool palette with that tool selected and come down to the texture map, and this is on a per subtool basis. So open up texture map and you can see right now we don't have a texture map assigned, but if we click on the swatch, we can grab one of these textures and you can see as I click on those, they're applied over the top of our model. Okay, so great. We've got our earth texture on our model. Now what are we going to do? Well, let's say we want to come in and paint on the top of that. So let's say we've got we'll just use our star pattern. Nothing happens. That's because this is a texture, and when we're painting, we're poly painting. So they're two different things. If we turn this texture off, we can add our star just fine. With our texture on though, it's only showing what's on that map based on the UVs of the model. Now there is a way though to be able to get this texture map in the form of polypaint data. Okay, and so what we would do is go to polypaint from texture. Now you can see it looks pretty much the same, but the texture is now off, and so now we can come in and polypaint on top of that. Okay, so that's been converted into a polypaint. We can then go back if we want to make this into a texture again after we're done painting. We can go back in and say create new from polypaint, and this is in the texture map area. Now it's a texture again. So just think of it as when you're painting, you're poly painting, you're actually coloring the points. But when you export this out, or if you have something external that you want to bring in, you can work with it as a texture map, but you just want to make sure that you convert between those at appropriate times. So when you're painting, it's going to be poly paint, and then at the point where you want to save it out as a map, you would go into texture map and say new from poly paint, or vice versa. If you want to bring in a texture map and you want to convert it to polypaint to work on, it's going to be this polypaint from texture. Okay, and then if you wanted to export that, you don't export it from here, you'd actually clone it. It would send it over here, and then you'd be able to export it. So it's going to be able to see that from the texture palette. It's going to be able to see that. Now you can export that as an image file. Okay, so again, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but again, this texture map assignment is based on the individual subtool. So if I selected a different subtool, I get another option to bring in another texture map for that one. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about is something that's very important to ZBrush, and that's polygroups. It's going to be a big part of your workflow as you're working in ZBrush. So we'll take a look at that next.